Vintage jumbo bricks. Ooh. Vintage fire station. Vintage Fabuland. A vintage bakery. Vintage space. It's also a cool YouTube channel. Check her out. Vintage space. A box of vintage sets. A vintage chalet. More vintage sets. Vintage tipper truck collection. Vintage Thomas. Wait a minute. Vintage Lego vehicles. A vintage antique car. Huh? Hey, it's Jabbo. Welcome to BrickTsar, your home for vintage Lego.
You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
I really like vintage Lego. But what is vintage Lego? I don't know. I've been saying it a lot, and maybe there's a debate about what actually is vintage. So we're going to talk about that in this video. Now, about 8 months ago or so, I made a video asking that question, and I just never got around to following up on that video. I meant to do it for a while. I want to feature some of your comments from that video. So that's what we're going to do in this video. And we're going to try to find out finally what is vintage. Now we're focusing on Lego, and perhaps some of you have come over here in the year 2025 and you saw this title of the video and you wanted to know what vintage is because you collect vintage Hot Wheels, or you're into vintage clothing or something else vintage. Maybe you like vintage cars. I don't know why you'd come to this if you like vintage cars, but we are going to talk about vintage cars as they relate to Lego. But first, let's go to some of the comments we got in that video. Oh, and by the way, this is not vintage Magnum PI. If I was dressed in vintage Magnum PI, I would have Hawaiian shirt and short shorts. But this is, I borrowed this from Mrs. BrickTsar. She really likes Magnum PI. I don't know if I should be worried. But anyway, let's get to the comments from that video a while back. Brick System Brothers, who's actually, as they say here, they've made a video dedicated to this question. And he says the general consensus is 50 years. So this video was filmed basically in 2021. We're still in 2021 as I'm recording this. He said that would make it 1971 would be considered vintage. But he says also, I guess it's not firm with Lego, perhaps skewed towards the 80s because the plastic bricks, as we know, have only been around for 80 years or so. So we're going to see more comments like that where it's not as far back as 50, but that was his general understanding of it. I'm going to highlight some research that I did that tends to go with what he initially said, but we're going to contradict. There's going to be a lot of contradiction in this video. All right, this is from Kino Magi, who says, I think I agree that 20 plus years is fair for vintage. So that would be basically like 2001 and before. They say, in my mind, anything from the 90s and back is what I'm hoping to pop up when I type in the term vintage Lego or something on eBay. And so that's a whole nother rabbit hole. Typing in vintage Lego, it's my most used search on eBay. You do find older Lego sets, but they could be from last year, this year. You know, it's really confused now because there is the vintage camera that was a VIP promotion, so that's on there. But you'll see all ranges of things. You'll see things that are definitely from the 70s or 80s or 90s. Modern. Why do they have Star Wars, modern Star Wars sets in there? So, but for the most part, people that list their eBay items more accurately, it will be the older stuff. Maybe not 50 years old, but it's older. So, and we'll read some more definitions of vintage here in a minute. Simon Robertson said, I consider vintage Lego to be patent pending and pre-minifigure. So that would put it, and this is actually an idea I had for my channel of doing a series of Lego 1977 and before. 1978 is the year of the minifigure. So basically anything before that, which you mostly start getting into the patent pending era, that may actually go a little bit earlier in the 70s, but that's his idea of vintage. He says anything younger than yesterday. Oh, anything younger is yesterday. I'm sorry. Sin Killer J Tachikawa. Hey, he says the video game community is constantly arguing over what is retro. Pretty sure it's mostly people that don't want to accept that they are old now. LOL. Wait a minute. If vintage is 50 years old, I've been vintage for a while. Anyway, he says, I feel like vintage is the same way. If it was made before you were born, it's vintage. So if you're my age, it's got to be like 50 years old. But if you're like a lot of you watching, you may be a lot younger than me. I think there's a good mix, I think, with my community. There's a few people that are, I hate to say it, they're actually a little bit older than me. And there's some that are a lot younger than me. But I don't think it's based on our ages, though. But I can see where something like, as a kid, the 60s, when I was in the 70s, the 60s seemed like so far away. Mayo Hosko says, I used to say anything before 2003, but now I say anything before 2000 is vintage because of the new types of sets that were made in the early 2000s. 1999 Star Wars is vintage, but 2001 Bionicle isn't. So he's got a specific set of rules there. Brian Hillengoss says, vintage Lego is anything that's not part of the current era to me. Like you can see design and build changes even in city or other things. So basically things that are discontinued maybe. Brick trains. Oh, he adds another rabbit hole down this thing here. He says, okay, now I feel antique. Turn of the century. I remember when that meant 1899. So that brings us to this, which is the vintage antique car. It's more than 50 years old as Lego goes. The Lego set name is Antique Car. So it is both a vintage and antique at the same time. And I wanted to get another example out here to show you, but I couldn't find it. There's another set. It's set 603, which I did a video of. No, actually, I take it back. I did a video of set 363. And then there's also 603. They're the same set with different numbers, something very common in the early era of Lego, vintage Lego, we will say. But one is called, it's the same build, same color, everything. The build's the same. One is called Antique Car. The other is called Vintage Car. So which is it? So this is the Vintage Antique Car here for this one. So I think I forgot the year that came out. I'm pretty sure I did a video on it. Joseph D27 says anything made before 1980 is vintage. DJ Brick says antique is 100 plus years old. I think vintage is 50, question mark. So those are all good answers and understandable considering things, but I like this answer the best. Sorry, everybody else. This is from Brick Fam. And he says, the lack of a universal definition for certain periods of Lego coupled with overlapping features along the date line, I think makes it hard to define the term with any accuracy. So that is a very good statement. He says, however, there are some undisputed milestones in the history that could serve as markers. Based on these, I would suggest to broadly categorize Lego into the following. And I like what he's coming up with. So first of all, he says antique. Anything before the celebrated 1958 date of the plastic brick, typically wood or metal toys. Though wooden boxes and HO scale cars and such continued into the 60s, and of course there were even early plastic prototypes before 58. The relative scarcity of many of these may contribute to using this definition. I like that as far as antique with Lego is considered. You know, cars, it's a different thing. I think they have different standards for that, but it's pre-tubed brick or about that era. So I like the HO scale cars going further. I do like that. Vintage, he says, the period between 1958 to 1978 with the introduction of the minifig. So somebody else already agreed with this says proto figs and maxi figs would count in the vintage era, but not maxi fig sets with minifigs or anything later already apparent in that overlap. It's a good range. I think that in the original video I made, I was talking about in comic book terms, like Golden Era, Silver Age, and things like that. Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze Age, that type of thing. He says classical would be 1978 to the color change of 2004. And that would include early Star Wars. I like this elegant term. If only to be purely rigorous, but probably no one would use it. So I'll stop there. I think you had some other things to say, but that's a good, nice breakup. I think that classic era of 1970s, the whole 80s, I'm very partial to the 80s. That was most of my teenage years, was the 80s. And I love a lot of the sets. When we did the A-Fool podcast, we picked 1980 as our favorite year, mainly because of the trains in that year, but there were also good classic space sets and other things. So that's pretty good. Now let's go to what the definition of vintage is. All right, so when you're talking vintage, you really need to know what you mean. This is vintage 2019. It's not really vintage. Oh wait, vintage. Vintage, the definition is the year or place in which wine, especially wine of high quality, was produced. So it's basically the year a wine was made. So this was made in 2019, so it's vintage 2019, but it's not high quality wine. So this is technically not vintage 2019 wine, but I'm going to say it is because that's what was on the bottle. And then you can use it, that's the word vintage as a noun, so it's vintage wine. So I think when we use it as an adjective. Tell me if I'm wrong. A noun, vintage 2019, whatever this wine is. Adjective would be relating to or denoting wine of high quality. So, oh, no, I take it back. The vintage is 2019. The wine is vintage 2019. I'm really confused. Okay, where did that come from? So if you look up the history of the word, it's actually from Latin. The word for wine and the word for remove. So it's when you took the grapes and made the wine, it got to this word that by the time English came around, they said vintage. So it's from those two Latin words that I'm not even going to try to pronounce that were put together. So it really relates to wine. Well, Lego did make wine bottle openers, so that's good. so that applies. And then it gets different when you get into other things like clothing. And my sister really loves collecting vintage clothing and room decorate. What do you call it? Furniture. One of her dreams is like to have her own antique store and to provide things that like movies make. And some of my sister's props are not really props; they're really real items, but they've been used as props in various TV shows and movies. And she's always like wanting to point them out. But it could be a lamp or something like that. But also the vintage clothes. So here's the definition in design. This is from Wikipedia, so take it with a grain of salt. It says, vintage design refers to an item of another era that holds important or recognizable value. This style can be applied to interior design, decor, and other areas. Vintage design is popular, and vintage items have risen in price. So high value or important or recognized valuable. So that could apply to a lot of things in Lego, even things that maybe at the time were kind of bad. Later we look upon them fondly. Like, this is pretty bad build, but I look upon it fondly. It's my vintage antique car. Another thing, and this is a blog post, what is considered vintage? So this was back in 2018. It says, vintage items are not as old as antique. However, unlike the definition of antique, labeling something vintage is far more subjective. I think that's why I use this quote. That's the important thing. It's subjective. There's no wrong answer unless you think 2012 is vintage. It says most antique dealers consider an item to be vintage if it is at least 40 years old. So this is talking about antiques, but again, I don't think that applies for Lego. But get back to another one. Is the 90s considered vintage? So I searched that, and this is the answer. The 90s are now officially classified as vintage because we are 2 decades and a new generation is starting to discover and enjoy the creative fruits of musicians, designer, artists, and filmmakers who delivered ideas 20 years ago. So now this thing is saying if it's 2 generations before, or it's 20 years, 2 generations. 2 decades. Okay, it's 1 generation. Okay, I'm not good at reading. Reading's hard. And so 2 decades, is 1 generation. So yeah, and there's other you could look up, but here's one. What is the difference between vintage and classic? Vintage denoting something from the past of high quality, especially something representing the best of the kind. Antique, having high value because of age and quality. Classic, judged over a period of time to be the highest quality and outstanding of its kind. So I think going back to, was it BrickFam? Yeah, BrickFam's comment, I think that's the best answer because these things have nostalgia and sometimes high quality, except for the brittle blues. So what do you think? Do you think those are some good comments that people left? I do. But I'm not going to say that it has to be at least 40 years or 50 years. I think it does need to be at least a generation removed. At the very least, discontinued to be considered vintage. But I like that, 20 years. So let's say 2001 now. Oh my goodness. I remember when 2001 was far away. I remember when 1984 was... We read that book, 1984, and 1984 hadn't happened yet. And then about that same time, Prince came out with an album. I'm like, who is this Prince guy? He's always on Casey Kasem's Top 40. And he was singing about, I'm going to party like it's 1999. But I'm like, well, 1999, that's far away. I mean, they hadn't even made Lego Pirates yet. They hadn't even made the classic castle yet. Oh, that started in 84. All right, so we get all that, and we get to the classic pirates. But those are now vintage pirates, I guess. And then 1999 came, and then I started working for the phone company. And in December 31st, 1999, I had to go to work and be at work to push the button or something when the Y2K bug was going to hit. You know, it's the easiest night of work I ever had, by the way. Thank you, Y2K bug. And now, that was before 9/11. You know, in 2001, that's 9/11. So is the year of 9/11, that tragic event, is that now vintage? That era of Lego? And I can't believe that's almost 21 years ago. What am I talking about? This is about to be 2022. Oh. When I started YouTube, wait a minute, vintage BrickTsar. That would be 2012. Wait, I said you can't, I said 2012 cannot be vintage yet. Maybe later. Wow, so I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, I'll be back tomorrow in another shirt, but I won't be drinking wine. You're supposed to hold it like this. I saw that on Columbo.
I've been doing a little research.
You gotta hold it like this.